Chapter 22. Holly froze in place when she saw the familiar figure of Cousin Harry, unannounced, sitting comfortably in an easy chair inside the infirmary. This was her time for her regular visit with Madame Pomfrey, but Madame Pomfrey was nowhere about. The last time they had pulled this stunt had been after Tom Riddle's curse, and Holly had been seriously ill. But this time, Holly scanned her memory quickly. She wasn't sick, had all her lessons completed, turned in on time. Had she done anything she shouldn't have? No, she didn't think so. She hadn't even written Vernon or her parents. "I'm fine," were her first words to Cousin Harry, ignoring customary politeness. "What are you doing here?" she asked him bluntly. Cousin Harry raised an eyebrow, making that scar on his forehead wrinkle up all funny. "Can't I just visit with my favorite cousin?" he asked her calmly. "No," insisted Holly belligerently. "None of the other parents do, and besides, it isn't your way." "No," agreed Cousin Harry soberly, "it isn't my way." "So why are you here?" asked Holly, repeating her original question. Cousin Harry shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Have a seat," he suggested, avoiding her question while pointing to a nearby easy chair, no doubt placed expressly for that purpose. Holly ignored the suggestion and remained obstinately standing in place. "At least shut the door," he requested politely. Holly gave the door behind her a shove with her hand, slamming it shut. "You may not have realized it," Cousin Harry began, "but Madame Pomfrey has been observing you very closely all week. I expect it's because of the plane crash. She reports your appetite isn't what it used to be, and says you don't seem to be sleeping well." "Who told her that?" asked Holly aggressively, feeling somehow her privacy had been invaded. "I doubt she needed anyone to tell her that," replied Cousin Harry gently. "You have rather large dark purple circles under your eyes." "Oh," said Holly, a little less angrily. "Anyway," continued Cousin Harry, "realizing the difficulty you had last year getting to sleep, and your rather unusual resistance to sleeping potions, she immediately wrote Healer Winnonan with her concerns. He wrote me, and requested that I visit you as soon as possible." Cousin Harry stopped and gave Holly a once-over appraisal. "Personally, I think you look fairly fine, too," he added. Holly relaxed a bit. "But I got the impression Winnonan wanted me to talk with you as a sort of preventative measure, before things reached the stage they did last year." Holly winced inwardly at that. She had been a total wreck before they contacted Cousin Harry that time. "I reminded Winnonan that I am no healer, and know nothing about sleeping disorders. But that didn't seem to bother him. He seemed to think what we accomplished together last year was nothing short of a miracle, and was of the opinion that this particular situation may require the same, Potter touch, I believe he called it, as well." Cousin Harry paused for a moment and then continued. "It's hard to say no to Healer Winnonan," he confessed. "So here I am." Cousin Harry straightened in his chair. "Tell me," he said, fixing his green eyes upon hers, "how are you doing?" Holly sighed and moved forward, flopping into the easy chair Cousin Harry had indicated earlier. "Lousy," she replied. It was almost a relief to admit out loud what she had already realized privately. "I close my eyes and I see nothing but dead bodies and body parts. And when I sleep at night, I see even more." Holly shifted to a more comfortable position. "It's even worse at mealtime," she added. "When I smell that food, especially the meat, all I can think of is more body parts, an arm, a leg, a thigh, charred on the outside, red on the inside, rare, medium, well done. It makes me sick just to think of it," she added. Cousin Harry winced at her words. "Do you want your memories modified?" he asked her bluntly. He was speaking of having everything removed like they had done for Meg in the fall. "I've thought about it," replied Holly sincerely. "Believe me, I have, but I don't know. It just doesn't sound right somehow. I really don't want to lose a part of myself, and yet—" Her voice trailed off. "I'd rather try to find some other way if possible." Cousin Harry nodded, as if he was expecting that. "We can keep it in reserve should nothing else work," he said calmly. "So what now?" asked Holly. "I took the liberty of making inquiries before coming here today," began Cousin Harry. "Mr. Tuttle got the impression you blamed yourself for the accident." "I should have known," stated Holly bluntly. "I felt their fear as they passed over," she added, hugging her knees. "They knew they were dying. I should have done something instead. I went back to sleep as if nothing had happened. I could have saved them all." Said Cousin Harry, not disagreeing with Holly's assessment. You do know how fast a plane flies, don't you?" Holly did not answer. "And, of course, it had to be flying fairly low for you to have sensed anything at all. Assuming you had wakened and understood exactly what you felt, it still would have been physically impossible for you to have given the alarm before that plane crashed, let alone performed some sort of magic to keep it from crashing." "I know," muttered Holly softly, reluctantly admitting what she had known deep inside. "But still," she persisted, "I should have raised the alarm anyway. We could have maybe saved some more if we'd only gotten there sooner." "Not so," disagreed Cousin Harry. "Headmistress McGonagall informed me that most of the people had been dead for a while, and likely died during the crash. They were cold and stiff," he added, noting the question in Holly's expression. "Further, she said the purpose behind the Muggle presence was never announced to the student body. You had no reason to connect your midnight experience with anything outside of Hogwarts. In fact," he added, "she's not sure how you managed to make the connection you did so quickly, given the scanty information you had available. I said you were good at puzzles. You are, aren't you?" he asked while straightening his glasses and looking over at Holly. No," replied Holly, "not really." She had always hated the tiny pieces, but Holly had worked quite a few puzzles when she was younger and too sick to do much of anything else. "Well, you are when it is important," Cousin Harry corrected firmly. "I was just lucky," she said glumly. "Luck puts you in the right place at the right time to get all the pieces," agreed Cousin Harry. "Brains did all the rest. Never forget you saved 11 people. That is no small feat." "But I didn't save 11 people," protested Holly, looking over at Cousin Harry, tears streaming down from her eyes. "I only found 7. If it were left up to me, those other 4 could have died." "But they didn't," countered Cousin Harry calmly. "Headmistress McGonagall realized immediately there might be more survivors the moment you said you couldn't sense anyone when they were asleep. She used the time you were helping Madame Pomfrey with the known survivors to look for others. That's how she found them." "But—" "No buts," insisted Cousin Harry. "You got them to the crash in record time. You couldn't be expected to sense and locate unconscious survivors." "I should have helped anyway. I should have hunted with them. But I couldn't. I got sick instead and sat on the sides while they kept on looking, kept on poking through the wreck." Holly's tears started anew, overwhelmed by guilt. "Holly," started Cousin Harry gently, "Headmistress McGonagall and Madame Pomfrey were both in London during the Blitz. I expect they have had considerable experience poking through rubble looking for survivors." Holly sniffed and looked up wonderingly. "I never knew that," she said, wiping off her tears. "You never asked," replied Cousin Harry. "They told me you behaved quite admirably given the circumstances, especially considering this was your first experience with things such as this. You have nothing to be ashamed of." Cousin Harry reached over, grabbed Holly's hand, and gave it a gentle but firm squeeze. "You found the plane. You saved 11 people. You did good, Holly," he said quietly. "Never forget that." Holly hesitantly squeezed Cousin Harry's hand back and, for the first time, felt a little bit better about her part in the rescue. "I think," he said thoughtfully, "I might be able to help you with your diminished appetite. If I recall correctly, Bavarti was a vegetarian, and she always ate quite well. That means there should be some fairly good vegetarian recipes around. Once the house elves know what you want, they should be able to prepare foods you might find more palatable right now. I'll have a word with them before I leave. Mind you," he added accusingly, "your dad will probably never forgive me if you come home from Hogwarts this year a vegetarian. Though I don't suppose that matters all that much now." Holly laughed briefly at Cousin Harry's attempt at levity. He was right, though. Dad would hit the roof about this. But they would face that difficulty later. "I suppose," she mused, "I could take my meals later or somewhere else so I wouldn't smell anything." "No," said Cousin Harry forcefully. "I don't want you hiding out like you did last year when you were learning to block." Holly looked at him with surprise. She hadn't known he knew about that. "That wasn't healthy," continued Cousin Harry, "and it didn't help. It only postponed things to a later time." "How did you—" began Holly. "No," finished Cousin Harry. "Of course I knew," he said gently. "James wrote me, as did Albus and Rose." Cousin Harry's voice softened. "They're family, Holly," he added. "They worry and they care." "Oh," said Holly in a small voice. "I guess I'll try to take my meals with the rest of the students." Do you suppose I could at least eat at the end of the table where there's a breeze and less odors? She asked meekly. An excellent idea, replied Cousin Harry. Now, continued Cousin Harry in a businesslike tone, knowing I would be visiting you today, and suspecting you might not want your memories modified, Hermione and I took the time to visit a Muggle library. Holly looked over at Cousin Harry. A Muggle library? She said in surprise. Why? Well, he began, we were thinking Muggles might have more experience in things such as this, plane crashes and such. After all, there were lots of Muggles out there cleaning up the wreck and picking up all the pieces. No doubt several of them felt much the same way you did upon visiting the scene. We did some research on the subject. Did you find anything? Asked Holly curiously. Quite a bit, actually, replied Cousin Harry. Apparently this kind of thing goes on all the time with Muggles. I don't know if any of it will be of use to you, though. Cousin Harry shifted in his seat and pulled out a small notebook. It looked like the same one he used when he was first explaining to Holly's parents how she had come to be so sick. First, he began, the symptoms you seem to be experiencing, loss of appetite, loss of sleep, and nightmares, are reported by Muggles of all ages who have experienced similar situations. Great, said Holly without enthusiasm. So I'm not alone. How does that help? Well, they seem to get over it without the use of magic. That means you can, too. What do they do to cope? Therapy seems to be on the top of every list. Therapy? Yeah, therapy, said Cousin Harry. It's kind of where you share your experiences with someone you trust. And that helps? It can, replied Cousin Harry. I remember whenever something particularly awful happened to me, he began thoughtfully, Headmaster Dumbledore would have me tell him about it, everything, and I told my friends. It helped to know someone out there knew exactly what I was going through, he added slowly, remembering. Have you talked to anyone yet? Of course, replied Holly. I told the Hufflepuffs at the house meeting. Did you tell them everything? No, she admitted. They were so excited that I had found the crash and saved some lives that I hadn't the heart to say much more. And Becky? I told her more, replied Holly, but not the really bad stuff. It's too... Holly shivered. You don't do her justice, replied Cousin Harry calmly. You should tell her the rest. She's your friend, and she's stronger than you think. Holly nodded reluctantly at the suggestion. You could talk to Madame Pomfrey or Headmistress McGonagall, Cousin Harry added. They were there. They'd know what you were talking about. Holly shook her head. They were too calm about everything. So businesslike, she replied. It didn't bother them like it did me. They wouldn't understand. You could be wrong about that, commented Cousin Harry neutrally. Maybe they just keep it bottled up better than you. He glanced at Holly and saw her face was still unreceptive to the idea. No matter, he said without emotion. The two sat together silently for a while. Finally, Cousin Harry said simply, Tell me. Holly looked over at him in surprise. You? Yes. You talked to me last year, he began. I'll listen and I'll understand. I've experienced things that gave me nightmares too. Not like yours, of course, but still. Besides, he added lightly, how am I supposed to figure out how to help if I don't know what happened? Holly sat silently for a while, considering. Finally, she began to speak. I couldn't see where I was walking, she began hesitantly, because of all the mist. But there was this smell. Harry Potter sat in silence with Holly a long time after she finished her story. McGonagall had said the crash site was pretty grim, but hadn't gone into details. Harry could understand why. He felt sickened by the things Holly described, and now understood why Healer Winonan had written him so swiftly at Holly's first sign of distress. Had Dumbledore felt this way after Harry talked with him? Holly had saved invaluable time in locating those 7 survivors, but in doing so, she had crossed over most of the wreckage site, seeing what lay there. Harry seriously considered suggesting memory modification again. No one needed memories such as these. Surely these memories could serve no useful purpose and would be best forgotten. But Harry resisted the temptation to make the suggestion. Holly knew better than anyone what those memories contained, and she wanted to try to keep them. He would defer to her decision, for now. I do feel better having talked about everything, said Holly, interrupting Harry's thoughts. Will this stop the nightmares? Her question gave Harry pause. How could he word things, be honest, and yet not discouraging? It had been essential she recount her experiences. Talking always helped. But it hadn't stopped Harry's nightmares. Eventually, he said finally. Holly twisted around to look at him. Eventually, she asked, regarding him intently with her green eyes. How long? Harry sighed. Well, he began carefully, it looks like some of the muggles go into therapy for years. Years, replied Holly, dismayed. How long was it for you? Me? Said Harry in surprise. Yeah, about Cedric. How did she? Of course. Dudley knew he had had nightmares about Cedric. He must have told Holly. Aloud, Harry replied, I couldn't say. I think my nightmares about Cedric got replaced by even scarier ones. He didn't mention he still got them occasionally, still saw Cedric lying on the ground beside him with his eyes wide open and his mouth half opened in surprise, still felt the terror of that night. Well, isn't there something else I can try to stop the nightmares? Some of the books mention meditation, he began hesitantly. What's that? Well, you sort of focus your thoughts on something else so you won't think of the things that give you nightmares. Oh. Holly settled back in her chair thinking, that sounds a bit like what you do to practice alchemy. Alchemy? Harry raised an eyebrow and looked over at Holly. You know about alchemy? Well, yeah, said Holly, twisting back up to look at him. It sort of goes with the dueling. She leaned back down in her chair. Anyway, you're supposed to empty out your mind each night, making it more difficult for others to get into it, or something like that. Yes, replied Harry, struggling to remember his own attempts at alchemy. They hadn't been very successful. But then he'd been a rather lousy, uncooperative student. You empty out your mind, he said, remembering, and then fill it with something you love, your family, friends, anyone that's important to you. He trailed off, remembering those he had loved, especially those who were no more. The book doesn't mention that part, said Holly. Book? Oh, yes. Alchemy had become part of Hogwarts' curriculum after the battle. Of course there'd be a book. Wait a minute. Harry looked down at Holly in surprise. You've been practicing alchemy? He asked her. I was, replied Holly, though I don't know how good at it I am. I don't especially want someone yelling legumes in my face to find out. Have you been doing it lately? No, she confessed, not since the crash. I've been thinking of other things. I think you should go back to doing your alchemy exercises every night before bed. Treat these dreams like an outside mental invasion, and maybe you can keep them away. I can do that, agreed Holly hopefully. Is there any other problem we need to tackle? Asked Harry. Holly mutely shook her head. Then I think that's all we can do for now. You have some things to try, but we need to give them some time to see if they'll work. How about if I come back next week and see how you're doing? Would that be okay? Holly nodded again. It is rather late, began Harry. Would you like to spend the night here or back in the dorms? In the dorms, I think, replied Holly. May I escort you to the dorms, then? Holly nodded, and the two of them got up and left the infirmary. Let's see, said Harry as they walked up the steps. You're dueling and practicing alchemy. Is there anything else? The question was purely intended to pass the time as they walked. But when Holly didn't answer immediately, Harry realized there was something else. He stopped and looked at Holly, waiting for a response. Holly looked down. Her long blonde hair hid her face. I guess I can tell you, she began hesitantly, looking up at him with her green eyes. I'm learning how to play the organ, she announced. The organ? Where the heck did she find an organ, let alone an instructor? More importantly, why? May I ask why? Harry asked, keeping his face carefully neutral. This was obviously very important to Holly. Harry did not want to discourage her from talking. Well, it was what the room of requirement provided me when I said I needed to learn how to selectively block. Did it? Said Harry faintly. Well, that explained the organ. At least I think that's what it wants me to do, added Holly as they resumed walking. The room always has an organ music, and instructions whenever I return. It sounds to me like you have interpreted the room correctly, replied Harry carefully. though I have no idea how playing the organ relates to blocking. The room of requirement usually knows what it is doing." "That's what Mark said," agreed Holly. "He said that since nobody knows how to selectively block, maybe learning organ is what you have to do. At least it couldn't hurt." "Mark sounds most intelligent," replied Harry. Holly nodded in agreement. Inquired Harry delicately, "are you any good?" "I don't know," replied Holly honestly. "I haven't been playing for very long. Becky says I'm pretty good, but she's my friend. She always says that." "Would you, like to hear me play?" she asked timidly. Harry looked down at Holly. "I would like that very much," he said quietly. "Do you have the time? Perhaps I could listen to you play now." "Okay," said Holly. The two changed their direction and headed to the 7th floor. Holly led the way, chattering happily. It was good to be able to talk about the room to someone. "When we first opened the room," she began, "it just had this smoky old pipe organ inside. It didn't even work. Becky thought maybe I hadn't done things right, but I knew I'd followed Professor Longbottom's instructions correctly. So we figured that the organ must have something to do with selective blocking. So we fixed it. And every time I go to practice, I think about how I need to learn selective blocking, and it gives me the organ and music books. You sure it doesn't have a loose screw somewhere?" "I shouldn't think so," replied Harry thoughtfully, remembering his own days within the room of requirement. "Good," said Holly with satisfaction, "because it seems to be working fine otherwise, except for the smoke." They got off the stairs and started down the corridor. "Well, the room got seriously burnt during the Battle of Hogwarts." "That explains it," said Holly. "I've been wondering, but didn't really know who to ask, or even if I should. We decided we wouldn't mention it to anyone unless we had to. The room seems to be sort of a secret, you know. Professor Longbottom and Professor Lovegood wouldn't tell us much of anything about it at all." "The room can be many things," replied Harry, remembering, "depending upon the need of the person using it." "Oh," replied Holly thoughtfully. "What did you use it for?" asked Holly as they rounded a corner. "If you don't mind my asking. I mean, you must have used it, or you wouldn't know about the room." "I needed a place to practice spells," replied Harry, vaguely, not mentioning the circumstances surrounding that need. "Oh," said Holly, "that's a lot different need than mine." Harry nodded. "It served its purpose," he said simply. "When do you find the time to practice?" he inquired curiously, as they drew to a stop beside the blank wall that sometimes had a door. "In the morning before breakfast," replied Holly promptly. "Nobody else is around then to watch us." Harry nodded. He watched while Holly paced back and forth, remembering his own days pacing before that very wall. A small door appeared, scorched black with a blackened doorknob. Holly pulled out a handkerchief and wrapped it around the doorknob. "Otherwise my hand gets all sooty," she explained as she opened the door. Holly held it open for Harry. He entered, stooping his head to do so. Holly followed and closed the door behind, locking it with a huge brass key that hung on the wall next to the door. The tiny room was nearly filled with the huge double keyboard organ. The organ pipes loomed way above Harry's head, vanishing into the high ceiling. "You repaired this?" Harry asked wonderingly, looking at the blackened keys, scorched sides, and pipes. He shuddered to think what it must have looked like originally. "Yep," said Holly proudly, eager to show off their efforts. She moved to the wall and unfastened a rope tied there. "Mark found most of the right spells," she added, as she carefully lowered the single chandelier that hung up high in the ceiling, retying the rope when the chandelier hung just above the bench, its brightly lit candles illuminating both keys and music. "He even tuned it after Becky said it sounded worse than a screech owl." "I am most impressed," said Harry warmly. He looked around the room, noting the sparse furnishings, and then his glance fell upon a small table near the lone chair in the room. Wonderingly, he picked up the embossed papers lying there. He looked at them briefly. Then he handed one to Holly to read. "Program: Pipe Organ Concert. Premiere Solo. Given to Harry Potter by Miss Holly Ann Wycliffe." Holly colored when she read it. "I didn't mean anything like this," she began, embarrassed. "I mean, I was thinking it would be nice to do something like this someday, but I'm not nearly good enough." "I'm truly touched," said Harry warmly. Holly's cheeks flushed pink. "You mean it?" she asked, looking directly into his face. "I do," assured Harry sincerely, looking back. Every time he saw Holly, she looked more and more like the photos he had of his mum. He hoped no one gave her problems about that. He loved his mum dearly, but had never heard of Lily rescuing plane crash survivors or playing the organ. Holly was her own person and deserved to be treated as such. Holly used her handkerchief to wipe the sooty black off the organ keys and then picked up 2 pairs of puffy earmuffs that were sitting on the side of the keyboard. One was lime green with orange stripes, and the other was peach-colored with dark blue spots. She handed the green ones to Harry. "You'd better put these on before I begin playing," she advised, putting the peach-colored ones over her own ears. "It gets kind of loud in here." "Thank you," said Harry, looking curiously at the earmuffs, but not putting them on. Holly was not yet ready to play. He watched Holly set up with interest. "I had a heck of a time getting the bellows to work," said Holly conversationally, as she placed the program on the music stand. "In the beginning, Mark or Becky would pump them for me while I played, but one day they just quit working." "Really?" asked Harry, settling down more comfortably in the chair. "Yes," replied Holly, getting into the bench. "No matter what they tried, spells or by hand, they just wouldn't go." Holly continued while she started pulling out stops and pushing in various buttons. "I finally got them to move by using a flutter spell, but then I had to try to play the organ, too. It was really hard, at first even to make a sound while playing while trying to keep the bellows going. I'm a lot better at it now," added Holly, "but sometimes I still forget, and then I lose my sound. It's funny how they won't go for anyone else." Holly wound her long blonde hair into a bun on the top of her head. Next, she put the earmuffs on. The earmuff strap fitted snugly over her bun, helping to keep it in place. Then Holly got out her wand, muttered a spell, and the huge lever next to the organ, the bellows, began to move slowly up and down. Holly sat facing her music and stuck the wand into her bun, making sure it continued to point towards the lever. The lever continued to move up and down, pumping air, and then she called out, "Are you ready?" "Of course," thought Harry in amazement while he watched her prepare to play. Holly couldn't hope to selectively block unless she learned how to focus on doing more than one thing at a time. So the room of requirement had the right idea. Harry thought about telling Holly, but decided against it. She was smart. She'd figure it out eventually. Sometimes the quest was just as important as the solution. Harry put on his earmuffs and then he sat back in his chair. "Ready," he told her. Holly nodded and turned her attention to the music. Following her program, Holly began with the simple musical exercises she had learned designed to warm up her fingers. Then she moved on to the few melodies she had learned, finishing with her most recent piece, a song played with simple left-hand chords. The performance didn't take long, but Harry realized it represented more than just the music on the page. It was a major accomplishment, considering all the effort required to get to that point. Holly twisted around on the bench. She grabbed her wand, stopping the bellows, and took off the earmuffs in the silence that followed. "Well?" she asked anxiously. "That was incredible," said Harry enthusiastically, while removing his own earmuffs. "I know it isn't much," Holly began hesitantly. "It is much more than I could ever do," replied Harry warmly. "I had no idea an organ could sound so well." "Do you think so?" asked Holly eagerly. "It's kind of distorted with the earmuffs, but I like it." "I do too," agreed Harry. He held up his copy of the program. "May I keep this?" he asked her. Sure if you want," replied Holly, flattered. "Someday," he said solemnly as he rolled it up carefully, "when you are a famous organist, I shall be able to say I heard you first." He smiled as he watched Holly's face turn red with embarrassment. "That's never going to happen," protested Holly. "I'm not that good," she said, putting her own program copy carefully into storage beneath the bench seat. "One can never tell," replied Harry seriously, as he tucked the program beneath his robe. "You know," he mused, "they say that music can soothe the savage soul. Maybe you should practice right before bed. It might help you sleep better." "That's an idea," replied Holly thoughtfully. "But no, I don't think I could do it. We're not supposed to be out that late. I mean, I could get to this room easy enough after dinner, but getting to the dorms without being noticed afterwards might be a bit tricky. The Slytherin prefects are always on the prowl for rule breakers. Slipping past them once or twice is pretty easy, but every day, someone's bound to notice." "Then perhaps," replied Harry thoughtfully, What you need is a way to get back to the dorms without being noticed. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah, I guess so, said Holly uncertainly. She looked questioningly at Harry and then noticed that he was glancing significantly to one side of the organ behind the bellows handle. Holly turned to look and saw a small door, charred and smoky, in the wall. It hadn't been there moments earlier while she was performing. Is that what I think it is? She asked Harry wonderingly. Perhaps you should check it out, directed Harry. Holly obediently got up and went to the door. She opened it easily, and huge clouds of smoke billowed out. When the smoke cleared, she peered inside. It's dark, she pronounced. Use your wand, suggested Harry. I'll wait. Holly pulled out her wand and held it out before her. Lumos, she said with confidence. A soft light from the tip of her wand appeared, and she entered the passage. The light vanished as Holly rounded a corner somewhere. A few minutes later, the light reappeared along with Holly stepping out of the doorway. It comes out behind a portrait in the dorm library, she said excitedly. Want to see? Ah, no, said Harry lightly. Dorm library? Maybe Gryffindor should have one of those, too. I'm a Gryffindor, he explained. I shouldn't be visiting the Hufflepuff dorm. You run along to bed now, he told her. I'll see you next week. He hugged Holly and gave her a light kiss on her forehead. Sleep well, he said. I will, she replied confidently. Moments later, Holly vanished again through the passageway, leaving Harry alone in the room with the organ. Harry Potter returned to the chair and sat down. He had made arrangements to stay the night if necessary, but hadn't specified where. This room would do well. It was quiet, and he wanted to think. For a long time, Harry watched the flickering flames in the chandelier while he let thoughts drift where they may. The visit had caused many old memories to resurface. They mingled with new ones, vivid accounts related by Holly of her experiences of the crash site and of smoky organ rooms filled with music. At some point the chair turned into a recliner. Harry leaned back and settled himself more comfortably. The candles in the chandelier burned out one by one, gradually darkening the room. Harry reached down to the side of the recliner. His hand touched a warm blanket and a pillow. He covered himself with the blanket and put the pillow beneath his head. After the last candle of the chandelier flickered out, Harry closed his eyes and went to sleep.